This is our last class on the economics of the Civil War.
And we decided to have two more.
We did, but we've already had one of those two.
Well, we did. Okay.
And we have just a few topics to cover. But there are three very important topics, I think. The first is Black Reconstruction. In the book, we don't go into detail about the era after the Civil War from 1865 to 1877, known as Reconstruction, primarily because we didn't know much about it. And it wasn't the topic of any of our research. But the topic of Black Reconstruction, I think, is very important. Is a very important topic. And it's something that social scientists have said, it's not just slavery, but it's the impact of Reconstruction on the subsequent development of the African American or black population in the United States. And what we did was we took the research of Robert Higgs, an economist and economic historian, who looked at the impact of the former slave population from 1865 to 1900. And so we just sort of detail some of the main general results on that population. The first one that is pretty much a no-brainer, we all would suspect that the black population suffered tremendously during the Civil War. The economy of the South, that's one of the things that we've been pressing on the entire class, is the economy of the South was collapsing on the weight, because of the weight of all this government intervention, and it was essentially drying up. The capital stock was gone, the labor supply was severely restricted, the output for the South's most valuable product was cut off, and things like the food supply were drying up and being reduced throughout the South. So all Southerners were suffering hardship. Black Southerners were suffering in particular. They didn't have any ability to adapt to changes as a result of the war because they were slaves. They couldn't move unless they were allowed to. They weren't allowed to make their own production decisions very often, and so their lot was severely compromised as a result of the Civil War. However, they did get their freedom. That is the big and really only wonderful thing we can say about the Civil War, is that as an unintended consequence of the people who started the whole thing, the black population got their freedom. However, at the outset, the end of the war, the beginning of the peace, the start of Reconstruction, predictions for their future were very dire. Not only were they in difficult circumstances, but Northerners and Southerners alike, and you can see this in newspapers, particularly in the North, was that many people believed that the black population would not survive, that it would simply die out. And given their freedom, that they wouldn't be able to manage themselves, manage production on their own, manage their lives, and that they would quickly starve to death and essentially disappear. In contrast to those dire predictions, however, the black population recovered very quickly after the end of the Civil War. They began producing as farmers and other jobs after the war. Many of them moved into urban areas and took up jobs in the city. The fertility or the number of births accounted for in the black population did decline, but that could be expected. Higgs sort of explained that as more and more of the former slave population moved into cities, that it was typically the case that people who went from rural areas into urban areas had fewer children. There was a decline in mortality in the black population and increases in income. Of course, slaves technically didn't have income, but there's a level of income that can be attributed to them in the sense of how much food, clothing, and shelter did they receive as slaves. Well, that level was set before the war. And then after the war, their level of income, monetary income, began to increase. So there's a decline in mortality, the number of people dying in this population, higher incomes, but of course those two things are very much related. There's better food, better clothing, better shelter. Very often we associate longevity with health care. But actually health care doesn't correlate very well with longevity, mortality, infant mortality, and things like that. Income is actually the best determinant of how long a population lives, how quickly they die, infant mortality rates and that thing, because food, clothing, and shelter are really the things that keep us healthy. It's only when things go awry that healthcare comes into play. This population, the former slave population, essentially received no government assistance. There was no big government program of Reconstruction in terms of benefiting the former black slave population. There was some efforts at providing health care. There was some efforts at providing some education in localized areas and things of that nature. But there was no big government program to help this huge population of former slaves. The population essentially went out and worked. They did more homemaking and education. So women were less involved in production with freedom, and they spent more time as homemakers and more time educating children and themselves after freedom was won. In terms of farming, where most of the former slave population was working, initially, after the war ended, most of the former slaves engaged in what's called share tenancy. They basically became renters of farmland from the large farm owners. Okay, so the initial arrangement, the idea of paying the slaves to work on the farms, wasn't a really efficient system, because that would require the landowner to monitor the entire workforce. And usually the landowner didn't have enough cash available to pay out workers throughout the growing season before the crops were harvested and sold. So they very often resulted in this share tenancy where the land would be given to the slaves, former slaves, and the owner and the former slave would split the crop at the end of the season. So it would be a 50-50 share at the end of the season. However, over time, blacks achieved more ownership of their own land despite long odds. As a matter of fact, the next development from share tenancy was a fixed share tenancy, where the blacks would make arrangements with the property owners to rent the land for a fixed share. So instead of a 50-50 cut, they would agree to so many bales of cotton or so many bushels of wheat, or so many ears of corn, things of that nature. Now, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us a little bit about the way each side of the transaction thought of the other side. Initially, it's a 50-50 split. Whatever comes up, we'll just split it. But now, the renters are agreeing that we'll pay you a given amount. And then the owner agrees to that. So that the renter has confidence in themselves that not only can they produce that amount to pay the rent, but they can also produce more. And anything above that fixed amount, they get to keep. So there's more profit opportunities for the renter, the former slaves, and less risk undertaken on the part of the landowner. So instead of them sort of splitting the risk 50-50, each of them being kind of an entrepreneur, now the landowner has essentially become a fixed income receiver, is not really involved in the project to any great extent, and the tenant now is taking on all of the entrepreneurship and can therefore say, well, if I bring in some new tools, or if I improve this land, if I provide some irrigation, if I find new ways to use this land that will make the total crop grow, then I'll get all the benefit. So this change in systems is an indication that the black population was not going to disappear. The black population was doing very well in managing the farms themselves. Increasingly, they were getting non-agricultural jobs in the market with equal pay with whites. And ownership of land, actual outright ownership of land by blacks, former slaves, increased significantly in the 1880s, 1890s in the United States. So the era of Reconstruction and its aftermath, from roughly the end of the Civil War to 1900, the Southern black population did extremely well. And its income growth rose at a higher rate than that of the white population. Now, that still left income in the black population below the white population as a whole, but it just shows you that the growth occurred at a faster rate and that the catch-up in income was significant. So if we were to look at the end of the war to 1900, we'd see the income of blacks started out much less than the white population. And both groups had some prosperity after the war throughout this period. But the catch-up in the difference was significant. So there was a huge difference in income at the end of the war, but that income difference shrunk considerably by 1900. However, as we get to the end of the century, some countervailing forces start to take place. You got Jim Crow laws, all sorts of laws that put blacks at a disadvantage against whites in the workforce. Unions were of growing power in this time, and they often were in part set up to provide a benefit to whites and to keep blacks out of certain professions. And in certain professions, blacks were essentially kicked out of those jobs. So we have all these forces. This is unions as in labor unions, not as in the union government, that were really providing roadblocks. The blacks had moved into agriculture, had done very well there. They had moved into certain professions and had actually gotten equal pay in certain professions. They'd started moving into more advanced professions with unequal pay. And that's when some of these legal barriers started to develop. And then in 1896, the Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, essentially allowing these types of legal restraints really put a stop to this process of economic catch-up or economic convergence of one race's economic performance with the other. There's no telling as to whether or not they would actually have converged to perfect equality or anything like that. But the process was at least headed in that direction in the post-war experience. Yes?
So what mark did Plessy specifically versus Ferguson do?
That upheld Jim Crow laws.
Segregation.
Separation but equal, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Before it got in.
Now, these first three categories there, did this have general application throughout the country, both in the North and in the Confederate States, the prior Confederate?
That's a good question, Jack, and I can't actually answer you concretely about that. Like I said, I'm treading on thin ice here. I really don't have a tremendous background.
Most of us, I think, have the thought that there was this migration from the South after the war, particularly as we approach 1900 to the North in the bigger cities, because most of the big cities were in the North.
Right. Yes, there's definitely a migration from the cotton growing areas of the South into the cities, both southern cities and, of course, northern cities, and then during the wars and that kind of thing, there was also big pushes at that time. Yes.
I think as far as the union goes, couldn't you make a distinction between the craft unions and the industrial unions? That the craft unions tended to be not necessarily racist, but a particular job would be all Italians.
Yes.
And all Irish, or something like this.
Yes.
And the industrial unions were much more open in terms of, hiring.
Yeah, that I'm not really sure about. There was a tendency on the part of employers to discriminate, so that if they had, certain jobs would be all black, other jobs might be all white, and then you might even find that you've got one job where they're all Irish, and another job where they're all happen to be Italian. So there was a natural discrimination, and sometimes it didn't really get reflected in terms of wage rates even. A lot of these cases, the black workers were receiving the same wages as whites, although sometimes they would be physically segregated at the workforce.
And the series on slavery on PBS said that right after the war ended, it looked as if the slaves were just wandering around, sort of arbitrary, but they said they were actually looking for their family. Like they had all been dispersed, and they tried to go and find family members. So what looked like a chaotic dispersion really wasn't that. It was them trying to find their roots.
Well, that's very very likely. They were trying to find work, and a slave on one plantation would very easily have relatives in neighboring and adjoining plantations. But there was also the case where owners would sell off some of their slaves into marketplaces. Now, typically, slave owners would try to sell their slaves either into the local market or in large groups. If they were going to move the slaves, say, from Virginia to Alabama, because the opportunities were better for growing cotton down here, they would move a whole bunch of them at a time. So whole family units would move. But there was one problem where families would get broken up on a regular and large scale, and that was bankruptcy. If a plantation, and this happened, even though there was a lot of prosperity, there were still business cycles and that kind of thing, and plantation owners borrowed large sums of money to finance their operations. And so when a plantation would go bankrupt because of the business cycle or because of tax burdens or maybe even just the death of the owner, the slaves would have to be sold off at auction to pay for the debts, because the slaves actually were the collateral for the loan. And so when that happened, and it happened quite often, your family members, could be dispersed anywhere. They'd be sent to a slave market, and then, so they all get sent to Mobile, and they're auctioned off to different owners, some of them who may be planning on reshipping them over to Louisiana. So the slave family was broken up in that manner. And, so naturally that would be a likely thing is, to go look for your parents or to go look for your children. You might have some idea of where they were. You might know where they were. But after the war, the plantations were being dispersed, people were moving around, so it certainly was a chaotic and tremendously unnerving experience directly in the aftermath of the war. It's hard to imagine. Yes?
Didn't some of the more humane slave owners and plantation owners have some kind of arrangement where they might be able to keep track of the slave who's part of his family sold, keep track of those?
Yes.
They did they?
Yes, you could keep track. Like, for example, if you've got a wealthy Virginia family, and the eldest son gets married and decides to go to Alabama to start a plantation down here, and is given a group of slaves in order to establish that plantation. Well, they would take whole families, but those families would still be related to the families up in Virginia. So they would keep track of one another by between the slave owning families, and also travel with the owners. The owners would always travel with slaves as assistants and that sort of thing. And so there would be contact directly through that way. But yes, there would be ways of keeping in touch. And of course, the slaves would run away on a regular basis. And but they weren't running away to really run away. They would run away at the end of the growing season to go visit their parents or whatever, or their sweetheart or their children, and then they would come back a few months later. They weren't really, running away to thinking they were going to get away. They were just running away to go see family. So a lot of that kind of stuff happened. It's not really talked about in any of the traditional histories, but it was a huge slave population, very difficult to manage.
One other comment. It said it was typical for a master to father an average of 10 children, to through the slaves. So I'm just thinking this might be one of the reasons when they went from the agriculture into the cities that the birth rate would drop down after being given their freedom. Because there'd be no statistics on that. Like how many, because it was approved. You know, it was an ongoing thing. And when you owned the slave, you were allowed to use them any way you want. So that was the number, like the average number. And you know, you said when they were free and they moved to the city, then their birth rate dropped. Well, that could be one of them.
Could be one of the reasons, yeah. I don't really know. I've never heard that number before.
That was on that same PBS thing on slavery.
Well, building of America, slavery. Did you hear the episode where they said most Americans were inclined to discriminate against those people? Man, I'm telling you, that outfit is no good at PBS. I mean, that is the most unfair documentary I ever listened to. I only heard two. I made sure I didn't hear any.
I just heard the last one, but it was one where it was like after the war, and they were showing the relationship between some of these slaveholders. I mean, it was sort of an economic arrangement. Some of them would let their slaves work in the city for a certain kickback. You know? And so it wasn't like all negative. It just sort of tried to explain the situation between the master and the slave.
Yeah, well, and as I said, you know, this population was so large and so difficult to control that there were a lot of different ways that the masters tried to control the slaves, and you know, they used the carrot and the stick. They didn't really like to beat the slaves, because if a slave had you know, whip marks on their back, they were of no value to sell, because no one would want to buy a problem slave. So they were inclined to use incentives. They were inclined to use self-management, so that the slaves managed themselves in many aspects of their lives, such as making their own food and growing their own food, and incentives for good production, things of that nature. To Ozzy's point about that, in terms of the North and South, there was a lot of anti-black view in the North as well, and many of the states in the North actually prohibited people from bringing their slaves to the North or freeing their slaves to the North. They passed laws to prevent that kind of thing, which is the primary reason, in addition to the laws that required the returning of runaway slaves, that the Underground Railroad ended in Canada, was because it really wasn't possible for slaves to seek freedom in many of the northern states. They just weren't allowed to. Now, there's a little section in here which I think was kind of a neat little discovery called Lincoln and the First New Deal. That was one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning of the class, that we were going to come across where the term the New Deal came from. And the first time that we know the term New Deal was used was that a newspaper man from North Carolina used the term to describe Lincoln's policies and how they were beneficial, and that Lincoln was going to be providing you North Carolinians with a new deal. And that's why we need to get back into the Union, essentially. The newspaperman was arguing that the war was over, but we need to lay down our weapons mentally as well, get back to our lives, accept defeat, accept the Union. And here's Lincoln. he's a good guy, and this is all the stuff that he's going to give for us. And he described it as Lincoln's New Deal. And then in the book, we list all of the things that Lincoln provided and which were passed on his watch during the Civil War. The Morrill Tariff, the first income tax, an expanded postal service, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Land College Act, the Department of Agriculture, the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, the Transcontinental Railroad land grants, the National Banking Act, the Comptroller of the Currency, the National Academy of Sciences, free urban mail delivery, Yosemite Natural Reserve Land Grant, Contract Labor Act, the Office of Immigration, the Railway Mail Service, and the money order system. And there's a lot more, of course, that was passed during this, but we just sort of list some of the main ones to sort of give you a flavor of how Lincoln's burgeoning of new government, new governmental services, new governmental agencies, new regulatory bodies is very similar to what FDR and Roosevelt put into place during his time in office, with all sorts of new offices and new legislation and new regulations, providing all sorts of tangible governmental benefits to everyone. So I thought that was kind of a good indicator of where we go with the sort of the last main point, the last point of the book, which is the overall impact of the Civil War on American society, in particular in terms of the growth of government.
So can I ask you a question? After the Civil War, when the slaves were freed and they were becoming landowners, did the agricultural service of the Fed Agricultural Service help them out any? Or, I mean, did they go into that system?
The Department of Agriculture was pretty small. And not really involved to any extent. But it is a good point in the sense that the one thing that people note is that there was no redistribution of land at the end of the Reconstruction did not say, okay, Reconstruction, we're going to take this plantation, which was owned by one person and worked by 200, we're going to divide it up amongst 50 different families. There was no land distribution. As a matter of fact, the only cases where I've heard of big land giveaways on the part of the federal government in the South after the war was a few cases where white people from the North were given a big, huge tract of land someplace in Florida or Georgia or someplace like that. And I only heard of a few instances of that. I've never seen any systematic study, but we know that the former slave population didn't, in almost all cases, they didn't get land grants from the government.
They honored the land owned by the Southerners.
That's right. In most cases.
After the war as well. During.
In most cases. There were a few cases, I think, in the where the slaves were essentially given control of the former plantations, but again, that's just a few isolated instances that I know about.
Mark, before we leave this thing of Reconstruction, here at the end of the war, the Southern economy being almost exclusively agricultural, and with many huge land, aggregated land, plantations, and that kind of thing, and with the market shut, and with nobody to work the land except by some kind of freed up arrangement, I guess, with the slaves. And then the crisis, it seems to me, would have been the lack of funds to continue operations or to restart operations that perhaps have been upset for several years. Was there not a large exchange of land? Were there not a large number of bankruptcies? And is this the fiction about the carpetbaggers and the other category, the group coming down and buying land and this kind of thing when the landowners in the South were destitute effectively?
Yeah, there certainly is some truth to the idea. Basically, the agricultural sector could get restarted. Basically they would just, between the landowner and the former slaves, they agreed to, share the output so that, the amount of inputs necessary to start up agriculture, were fairly minimal. The owners didn't have to sustain the workers sustained themselves and that kind of thing. The problem occurred when, the Reconstruction governments started imposing property taxes on the landowners, and then the landowners couldn't. They could barely sustain themselves, and they couldn't pay their property taxes. And so those property taxes actually caused a lot of owners to go into bankruptcy and for their lands to be sold off at auction. The problem there, of course, was that there wasn't a lot of money. There was no savings left. Southerners who put their money into Confederate bonds had lost everything. Confederate currency wasn't worth anything. And so there was no savings. There was very little medium of exchange, money circulating in the economy. And so the inability to pay those property taxes meant that the lands would be sold off, and they would be sold off very cheaply. And so this is what provided an avenue for wealthy Northerners who had plenty of cash to come down and exploit that situation. I don't know what the extent of that was, so I can't really accurately characterize it, but I know that was the process that essentially pried this land out of the people who had owned it for a long time.
So that kind of Reconstruction bore little resemblance to what we think of as being Reconstruction today. Like when we go into Iraq or wherever, they would put these huge amounts of money in all kinds of institutions and get it out to the public and that kind of thing to try to get them the livelihood, try to modify and change, create new institutions and all that.
Yeah, I guess it does share some similarities. I mean, Reconstruction was certainly a military occupation, primarily, and that's basically the way it was. And it did transfer ownership from Southerners to Northerners. The market provided an avenue where it transferred some of it from white to black. And there wasn't really any significant program to help the people get back on their feet. It was more or less a military occupation of enough significance to get the cotton flowing into the northern mills, just as the Iraqi occupation seems to be only significant enough to get the oil flowing, but no big program to help the local people directly. Not that I think that they could come up with a program that would actually restore either Southerners or slaves or Iraqis to normality. War is is something you just don't get over. It's not something that you can, where there's any kind of magic eraser that we can just erase like on the board, and then all of a sudden the board goes back just the way it was. With war, you can't, you can never do that. But hopefully over a long period of time, things always improve. But one of the lessons of war is that it does leave a permanent scar, and institutionally, it almost always leaves us with a bigger government. In particular, in countries that win wars, end up with bigger governments. There's actually a phenomenon where war helps reduce government. But in order to get that sort of thing, you have to lose the war. So this is not clearly a straightforward win-win situation, but for example, this is debatable, but it is said that as a result of World War II, that Germany and Japan benefited in the sense that the war destroyed their fascist governments and their fascist economic policy and their fascist bureaucracy, which had gotten entangled in industry and unions and distribution networks, with the government in control of, the vital switches and dials in the economy, and that all sorts of regulations and price controls were put into place, and all forms of subsidies and credit rationing were put into place, and that the war and losing the war essentially destroyed all that, and those countries then adopted fairly simple, straightforward forms of government and economic policy, and of course Germany and Japan were two of the all-star economies on the globe during the 1950s and 1960s and even the 70s. Would somebody from Germany buy that story? Does that something that sounds like a fantasy, or?
Don't you think? The fact is, in the 48 or 47 in the U.S., because of all the money in Western Germany, even the new issued money to people, you get so much if you're rich, then you get a little more, and because of all regulations, period. Right like that. And it wasn't a few years till we had the German miracle, and the mark was the hardest money in the world.
I think since that time, though, the Germans have
they went back to their old habits.
re-bureaucratized, and the Japanese too in a different way, but they top head with centralized planning and that kind of stuff. But this is why Schroeder and Germany, in my view, and from what I read, and you know much more about this than I, but this is why they're having to come to terms with labor unions, and they're having to do away with a 35-hour week and go to 40 without increasing pay, or attempting to do that kind of thing to resolve some of the problems to make themselves more competitive. And because they simply have not sustained the growth that they've had for decades. We know them as the third biggest economy in the world, behind Japan and the United States, and with China coming up right behind. But that is the case, and I don't know whether this is part of the German culture, is our tendency to do this. I think all nations do it. It seems to me, based on my comprehension of history, is that the longer you go and the more you engage yourself in wars, as we do, that the more top-heavy you come with government. And our government's doing things now that a decade or two ago they never thought of doing or talked about doing. And in war, I think we don't call it war anymore. We call it this, that, or the other. But nevertheless,
it's now called
in more centralized government and more burdensome taxes, and more people being employed in the public sector, and it's just a very difficult load for the economy to bear.
Yeah, I don't think it has anything to do with being German or being Japanese. I think that they, are good examples. Good examples of how war destroyed the apparatus of too much government and cleared out all that bureaucracy, and but then this natural tendency of allowing government to grow over time seems to be unstoppable in many respects, and there's really there's two things here, and I'm going to go back to Bob Higgs again, and another one of his books. It's called Crisis and Leviathan, and critical episodes in the history of the growth of government in the United States. That may not be exactly correct, but it's pretty close to the truth. And in that book, Higgs explains that the growth of government occurs in two ways. One is the slow, steady growth, where the size of government gets bigger and bigger relative to the economy over time. And the second way in which government grows is through emergency. And in an emergency, government gets ratcheted up so that there's a big buildup in government for a crisis to address an emergency. And then once the crisis is resolved, government is cut back. But it's never cut back to its pre-crisis level. So that if we looked at government as relative to the size of the economy, and then we looked at it over time, what we see is that government starts out, in the United States it starts out very small. The federal government is almost non-existent, really. The majority of Americans in the beginning of the country will live their entire lives without ever seeing a federal government official outside of the postman.
Don't you have it in here? 5% of the gross national product.
Yeah, it's very low, and it starts out low. And this is not a historical model or depiction, but more of a stylized model of the growth of government relative to the economy over time. And then at some point, a crisis occurs or is engineered in some form.
Yeah, mostly engineered by the guys that want to be famous.
There you go, Ozzy. We're going to get you warmed up.
I've been marching in the street. I'm soling my boots, getting ready.
All right. Well, the crisis occurs and the size of government gets ratcheted up. Very quickly, there's a mobilization to address this emergency. And then the emergency lasts a period of time where essentially government is getting bigger, but just at the old rate. And then the crisis is resolved, and so there's a demobilization after the crisis. And then government gets back on its old path. This angle or this ascent can also change due to institutionalized forces, such as constitutional changes. If we were to adopt an income tax, for example, we might see this growth rate increase. But in the absence of that, we just wait for another crisis and another resolution to the crisis. And then we get back on the peacetime path or whatever, and we go until we hit another crisis and another resolution. And so Higgs's model of the growth of government is called a ratchet model.
It's exactly true. I mean, it's totally correct.
Well, I can't recommend more highly a book than Higgs's book. It's historical, it's theoretical, and I think the model is very compelling. And I will say that he mentions the Civil War as one of the first real ratchets in the growth of government. It doesn't form a major basis of his work. He just mentions it. He's more concerned with World War I, America's Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War. And
isn't the ratchet the coming back down, not the going up?
Why does it?
No.
The ratchet, it ratchets up. It doesn't go up and then ratchet back down.
Yeah.
But
It's a mechanical process.
But not ever back where it was. Or
Never. No, it doesn't. Except in those other cases, where you lose the war. That type of thing. And then you get, the benefit of
Mark, which one of you guys wrote the book on how much better off we'd be if the Kaiser had won World War I?
Well, I haven't written that book.
Somebody around here did. Who did an essay on it.
Well, in any case, there's other authorities or ways of looking at this growth of government. Richard Benzel, who's actually a Marxist, I think, describes the Civil War in great detail as the episode in America when central state authority was born. So where Higgs just says, this was the first major crisis and then goes on, Benzel says, hold on a minute. This war really changed everything. We used to be a decentralized republic of states, and now we are a centralized state authority that has all this precedent for presidential powers, the income tax. We have these new constitutional amendments which essentially take away real authority from state government and leave all ultimate authority in the central government. So I think that's also an important perspective on the Civil War and the growth of big government. And then finally, it's important to note, as we do in the book, that the Republican Party agenda, and this is something I've been pointing out over and over again, is an economic agenda of mercantilism. Mercantilism where basically the government provides a set of economic policies that create more government in the economy, such as protectionism, such as a national monetary authority, banking authority, and monopolies, special grants and privileges, and public works projects on the part of the government. And so that where the Republican agenda was known and still is today known as the laissez-faire economic policy, the truth of the matter is precisely the opposite. That they have and continue to represent, and I must say there's the modern Democratic Party represents pretty much the same thing. This agenda where you have a market economy, but the government is actively and constantly involved on a whole variety of fronts. And that is known as mercantilism, not capitalism.
Isn't it a matter of moving away from the Constitution, too? In other words, when I read the Constitution, the fact that the Federal Reserve System can be bought back any time, and they still put up with the regulatory character there. Every once in a while, I said that interest rates are going up or down, and they all jump like that. I mean, that's a departure from the Constitution.
Well,
And as you go along, you find that that's what's happening, and nobody's going the other way.
yeah, it's certainly the Federal Reserve is not in the Constitution. It's a separate act, and Congress could change that at any time. You know, and this is another example of sort of an untrue type of laissez-faire. The Federal Reserve is kind of one of the first public-private partnerships where you've got this private, semi-autonomous regulator of the money and banking attached to the government. And the government could sort of tell them what to do and they can get rid of them, but they're still there. And so it's kind of one of these public-private partnerships, and I've always found that to be a bad idea. I think people sort of succumb to the idea that, well, it's private enterprise, but it's government regulated, so it's got to be the best of both worlds. I think it actually turns out to be the worst of both worlds.
Exactly.
And so that's a good point. And then your general point about the Constitution, I think, is also valid. Whether you're talking about the changes that occur in this historical time, or for that matter today.
It's a terrifically flexible organism. It's full of simple declarative sentences, and the Supreme Court has been twisting them ever since the Supreme Court was set up. Sure. In other words, if everybody would more or less go according to the Constitution and do their job, but by now they got a triple layer bureaucracy in there, and the Constitution is like peanuts when he goes to kick the football. They pull it away. In other words, you never get a feel that you were the man that's making the thing go. It's some joker down there that pulls the string, and then it throws it off.
Do you get the point of Ozzy's discussion? It's a woman that pulls that football.
Yeah, I know, but...
Speaking of that, do you have a question, Clara?
I have a question. Is it true that Texas could secede from the Union legitimately?
It may have that authority. I know that they made some special provision when they agreed to enter the Union, that at some point in time the Texas legislature could decide to subdivide Texas into as many as 4 or 5 different states, but remain in the Union. Of course, the big advantage of that was that it would give Texans 10 senators.
Yeah.
But I don't know, they may have also had a provision in there for seceding from the Union. Several states, when they accepted statehood into the United States, made declarations that they were a free and sovereign nation, and that if any time in the future they were, wanted to, that they would, and no one would stop them. That's the way everybody kind of understood it. But the Constitution did not, the one thing that it did not do, and I think it should have done, was to have an explicit statement regarding the means of which an individual state could extricate itself from the Union, under what conditions and under what procedures. It was something that was never done. I don't know if the writers of the Constitution just assumed that states could withdraw at any time or not, but the failure to do that one simple thing, every important contract has articles of what dissolves the contract, and this one unfortunately did not have those explicit statements, and so but now it does, and those explicit statements say that you're not allowed out, and that they no longer have the authority of the type and character that they once did. So it got us into that mess, and it resolved it in a way I think would be in complete contrast to the wishes of the majority of the original signers of that document and to the leaders of the states that agreed to it at the time. So,
yeah, the regulation states that a certain number of states approved the Constitution, then it's established. And every document, every commission, military commission, and of the Constitution of the United States, the 200 and something. In other words, that if that goes down, that you might go check it in, because that's the only organ that has stayed up there and made sense out of the United States. But it can happen. It's an institution. Any institution can fall down if the right number of people get a hold of the wrong steering wheel or something.
oh yeah, I mean there's
Right.
human institutions. They not only just change, evolve, and grow, but they come and go. Jack.
Yeah, Mark, I wanted just to revisit quickly this thing of tendency for governments to grow bigger and bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also applies to all public institutions at whatever level and whatever their function.
Any institution.
Well, that's true. I'm going to get to that, but to a lesser extent, because public institutions are spending somebody else's money, tax money, or whatever. And private institutions aren't. At least those that haven't been co-opted and are being funded by public money, and there are those too. Because they have a balance sheet they have to contend with. And it is true that some corporation that gets so huge that it's so institutionalized and so overweight and bureaucratically that they have the same problems, but nevertheless, even they have limits to what they can do. And it seems that public institutions don't have that, especially central government. And you look at the banking system, it was created by government to take care of government needs. It wasn't anything to do anything with you and me. I think it was to permit them to do their thing, and they're kept in no control.
Well, we've got a couple minutes, and so I hadn't planned on doing this, but I think it might be worthwhile to provide a solution to this problem of the growth of government, because
That's what we're looking for. That's why we're here, Mark. Now you're going to give us an answer.
well, I do have an answer. I do, yeah. And so you want to keep this government, the size of the economy model in the background here to our thinking. And Ozzy, what does it say in the Constitution regarding how we are represented in the House of Representatives? How many constituents is a congressman
Does
supposed
each
to?
congressman have? I don't know the figure. I mean, but it's there again by the Constitution. It essentially lays down the rule. But I know they can. Now the big crunches are changing the districts. They're maneuvering just like back in gerrymandering times. But and that they can do up. But they're supposed to only do it up to a certain point. It's supposed to be a limiting factor.
Okay.
That's the thing about a constitution. It's the reins of government.
Yeah.
And as long as that's held in, you've got a chance. But once a big hero goes, man on horseback.
It doesn't hold up, right? And the Supreme Court?
Because they're not doing what the Constitution says. They're making an excuse to do what they shouldn't do, but...
George.
Mark, if I remember that we worked this out one day, there'd be 4,000 members of the House of Representatives if we adhered to the Constitution. And if you think about it, that would be a good idea.
Yeah, well, that's the idea here, is that the Constitution says that each state must have at least one member in the House of Representatives. And it can have, each congressman would have a minimum of 30,000 citizens to represent. But it doesn't provide any maximum. It provides a minimum, 30,000. Every state gets at least one, but there's no maximum. In the early days of the Republic, from 1790 up until the late antebellum period, when they would do the census and they would find out how many people were in each state, they would allocate congressmen on the basis of population changes. So if one state got more populous, they would get more representatives. If all states got more populous, they would increase the number of representatives. And the allocation would occur on the basis of what I call the Jefferson Plan, which is basically that they increase the number of representatives in proportion to the increase in population. And so we started out with a Congress of less than 100 people, and it quickly grew to more than a couple hundred people.
And that's representative government. That's what constitutionality means. As long as they make allowances for that. Isn't that correct?
Roughly
so.
so.
Population increases, they apportion representatives to, and therefore they have representative government. But any anti-constitution, in other words, I write my congressmen or senators, and some of the stuff they don't even know what laws are on the books now.
I know.
We ask them to like that. Al Sharpton went over and he was a citizen, not unlike he was quote campaign unquote. He goes over to Ghana and consults with the head of the Ghanese government about the thing in Liberia. In other words,
anybody can do that, Ozzy.
He did it for humanitarian reasons, but that was unconstitutional because he had no representative. I got it from my counsel. He had there was no representation. The State Department had nothing to do with it. Nevertheless, he went over there, and when I got the congressman answer back, I knew darn well he didn't know that law. Okay,
in this next period, from 1860 to 1930, and these are very rough characterizations. Obviously, there's a lot of things going on. Reapportionment of Congress is the real political battle in Washington, D.C. All this stuff about legislation or treaties, almost meaningless to the political parties. Reapportionment of districts and things like that is the be-all and end-all of politics. Most citizens don't even know what's going on. They don't care. They don't think it's important. Believe me, it's the number one thing. Well, in this period, you have Congress increasing with the population. In the Hamiltonian period, and with his sort of view of things, Congress continued to increase in size, but less than the rate of population growth. And then finally, with the 1920 census, there was a big squabble about it, so they didn't do a reapportionment. And in 1930, one of the conditions of the reapportionment of Congress was the compromise, which left us with 435 congressmen, and it stayed that way ever since. Okay, so that the nature of representative government has changed in the United States at the congressional level from 1790, when congressional districts had anywhere from 30 to 60,000 citizens. Today, there are over 700,000 citizens in a district. So the whole nature of how congressmen get elected and how they represent their constituents has changed. You no longer have direct access, direct input into how your congressman represents you. They're off in a different city. They're somebody you've never met very often. You might see them on TV, hear their name occasionally. It even influences the way campaigning is done, which today it's mostly done through the media, through television, through TV reporters, sound bites, those sorts of things. They still have meetings and town meetings and that kind of, that's all just staged. It's not really the process of elections and the process of campaigning anymore. So the idea that I've come up with, and I've run statistical tests which support the inference that the fact that we have a much higher population per representative leads to more government spending in terms of real per capita spending relative to the size of the economy. This lack of representation means higher levels and higher growth rates of government spending. And the same is true at the local area. I mean, Auburn has grown in population from 22,000 to 50,000, but I don't think they've increased the size of the city council. And the state governments are the same way. They stopped increasing the size of their House of Representatives. And
that's the only way you're going to control the Congress, though. If they think they are going to get elected every election, they couldn't give a tinker's damn about what the people think of them.
That's right. And I think that just imagine if instead of your congressman being in some far off city, somebody you've never met, just think if your congressman, first of all, if we go back to this original ratio, the size of the House of Representatives would increase from its current level of 435 to several thousand members of the House of Representatives. That would, if we brought it back to the 30,000 level, would mean that there would be probably 2 congressmen living here in Auburn.
Pay these scoundrels so many of them. Originally, they weren't even paid. They didn't want paid. They were volunteer.
Yeah, I mean, there's no.
Now you got to pay them. What is it now? $175.
Well, no, see, you wouldn't have to necessarily. Those are things that probably only developed because Congress has become such an elite group. If you had a Congress of 4,000 people, George might have been the congressman at one point, and you might be the congressman in a few years. It wouldn't be a job that you would be a career type of a job necessarily.
It looked more like the Chinese National Assembly.
Something like that. And this would be somebody that you could walk to their house and knock on their door, or maybe drive to their house and knock on their door. To let them know how you feel about the way they voted on a particular item, so that it would provide a lot more diversity, a lot more representation, and think of the type of campaign that somebody would do to become a congressman. Running TV ads wouldn't be very effective because your TV ad would overlap several congressional districts. The type of campaigning you would need to do would be door-to-door, direct mail, type of neighborhood, what do they call them, neighborhood teas or coffees to meet the candidate type of campaigning. And so the type of campaigning, the type of representation, the description of the job itself would all change under this type of system where representation.
Gets more money than you are, there goes your influence. Same way with lobbyists.
Well, but Ozzy, it's with 4,000 congressmen. If you buy one congressman, what's the big deal? And it's a lot easier to buy the votes of 225 congressmen than it would be 2,500 congressmen. 2,500 congressmen who are no longer...
You know what you're saying? No, you're defining a corrupt government.
Well, but there's no... And the nice thing is that all these congressmen, I don't think that they would be career congressmen, congresspeople, whatever. I think you would see more of the type of government that the founders originally thought of, which would be the citizen representative, and we would elect people of known intellect and integrity.
We do.
And we could do that, and people who we knew, and so that's just a taste of this idea, and it's something that is a little surprising. But it's something that's built right back into our history. That this is the way things once were. This is another example, however, of a little thing in the Constitution that I think is a defect. I think we needed that explicit way out. And I think we needed an explicit cap on the size of the congressional, it could be no smaller than 30,000, but it can be no greater than, say, 60,000. If we had kept that cap working, I think, you'd have a government, with both of those things fixed, I think you'd have a government in the United States which would be so good, in a sense, that nobody would want to get out. What we'd have to be worried about is, other provinces and regions around the world trying to get into the United States. But I don't think we'd have to worry at all about states getting out of the United States. I think things would be just too darn good for anybody to consider it. Maybe that's what the Founding Fathers were thinking in the first place, that things are going to be so good in the United States that nobody in their right mind would want to leave.